in the cellar of Edmund Ruthven's house, as they'd done once before, under rather different circumstances, assuming the cellar wasn't already full of water. She hadn't heard from Ruthven in several days, and allowed herself a brief flicker of resentment at the fact that he was hundreds of miles away, on the continent, probably having an absolutely lovely time with his unsuitable boyfriend, and thus not around to let her stay in his embankment mansion until the weather stopped being quite so vile. Resentful or not, the fact that he was not only travelling, a thing he hadn't done much of for about 200 years, but doing so in the company of said unsuitable boyfriend, was something Greta found enormously pleasing. She'd known Ruthven all her life. He was a friend of the family, had extended his generosity to her father before her, and for most of that acquaintance he'd been thoroughly single and stayed firmly ensconced in his large and luxurious town home, the end of a block of buildings separating Inner Temple Gardens from the embankment, stirring abroad only very occasionally on some philanthropic venture or other. It hadn't been until the previous autumn that he'd felt up to leaving London, let alone the country, for the first time in decades. Granted, the house had been partially destroyed by fire at the time, and he'd had nowhere to stay, but still. That journey, a holiday in Greece, one which he'd shared with Greta herself, along with Varney and another friend of theirs, had been the first of many, including the trip to Paris this past spring, during which he'd met an equally stylish and sardonic vampire who'd come home with him after some complicated subterranean adventures, which she didn't care to recall in close detail. It was much nicer to think about Ruthven's warm, bright kitchen and the luxurious spare beds, plural, which he had available for guests. Nobody did hospitality like a vampire. Greta was, in fact, still so wrapped up in the thought of that luxurious home, and the way her old friend seemed to have lost decades off his not inconsiderable age now that he had someone to share it with, that it took her 3 rings to notice the phone's renewed demand for her attention. "Dr. Helsing," she said, when she picked up, aware that she didn't sound quite as brisk and in charge as usual, not caring enough to really make the effort. "Greta," said the voice on the other end, warm with relief. "Thank God you're in town. Are you terribly busy?" She sat up. It had been at least a year since she'd talked to Ed Kamal at a supernatural medicine conference in Germany. His job kept him too busy for much by way of socialisation. "Ed? No, I'm not in the middle of anything. What's the matter?" "I absolutely hate to spring this on you with no notice whatsoever, and I completely understand if you can't do it," he said, sounding both apologetic and hurried. "Do what?" Something's come up, and I have to go back to Cairo, more or less immediately, and there's no one I can really leave in charge of the spa, nobody with the experience to oversee the patients we've got, nobody who really understands the therapeutic regimens and the principles we're using. You're so good with mummies, and it'd only be for a few months, 4 at most." Greta stared at the phone, and then at the rain spattering against the window pane. "Wait," she said. "Let me make sure I've got this right. You want me to spend 4 months in Marseille overseeing Oasis Natrun?" "I know, it's a hell of a lot to ask," Dr. Kamal said, sounding wretched. "I mean, my nursing staff's fantastic. I'd never want to imply they're not competent to keep the place going, but I need a medical director who knows this stuff inside and out, and we have some particularly tricky clinical cases at the moment, and I can't leave without being sure they're going to have an expert managing their care whom I trust without question." Oasis Natrun, the private and exclusive mummy spa and health resort, where Greta had sent her own mummy patients who could afford a course of treatment whenever she possibly could, where cutting-edge, therapeutic, restorative and cosmetic techniques were being pioneered all the time, which was located in the south of France, where it almost certainly was not currently pouring with rain. "Ed," she said, cutting him off in the middle of another compound, complex, self-referential loop of apology, "I think the phrase I'm looking for here is, oh God, yes please." The mummy, Amennacht, was over 3,000 years old and on his 3rd set of replacement fingers, but this didn't severely impact his typing.